Welcome back to the On Adventure podcast. I'm Josh Self, and I'll be your host. My guest today is Matt Walker for his second appearance on the podcast. I had such a valuable time spending with him in the first episode that we came up with an idea to host a webinar, which we did a couple months ago, specifically for Ridgeline Wealth clients. But now I'm taking the audio and putting it on the podcast for anyone to listen to, because I think what Matt said was extremely valuable in a way that can be implemented in our real lives. Matt is part psychologist and part Big Mountain Adventure Guide. And so the combination of those two I find very fascinating, and specifically his discussion around the 5 elements of adventure. What are the key components that make something an adventure, and what do we get out of it when we pursue that? So I'm excited to transition the webinar into a format that anyone can listen to on the podcast. So without further ado, here's Matt Walker. So, all right, 6:02, I am going to go ahead and kick us off here. And I am really excited for everyone that is joining this evening. Matt Walker is our guest and presenter. And if any of you have heard one of my recent podcast episodes for On Adventure, Matt was one of my guests on there. And this webinar was kind of birthed out of the conversation that we had there. But I'm really excited to hear what he has to say, and I think you'll find out why here in a minute. But Matt's a bit of a modern Renaissance man, as both or an explorer, an artist, and a psychologist. He connects lessons learned from 24 years of climbing the world's most remote mountains on every continent, with also a master's in psychology to offer a unique perspective on personal and professional leadership. Matt's mission is to inspire a sense of adventure in all aspects of our lives, and he believes that through the spirit of adventure, we can fully engage in the most significant aspects of our lives. His work, published globally in print and digital as the author of Adventure in Everything, and was also the focus of a BBC documentary, Adventure Calling, and a platform for individuals to apply the spirit of adventure directly to their lives. And while Matt continues to lead mountaineering expeditions to the most remote regions of the world, and I'm sure he would love to talk to any of you about being part of those, his heart is certainly at home with his 2 children, his wife, and their daily life in Washington State. So, Matt, I think that is a sufficient tee up for you, and I will mute my line and let you take over from here.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Now, just to do the inverse, can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
And then I'm going to do a little screen share. And can you see the title slide there? And you can also see me. Great. So thank you for the introduction. Adventure is a unique beast. My mission is to remove the platform, the podium, the way that adventure is highlighted in the world as something that is other than, that has to be something that is some massive, significant goal or experience outside of your everyday, and that it's tied to Outside Magazine or the North Face or some big definition like that. That form of adventure, that's certainly a form of adventuring, and I'll speak to that in a little more detail. But my hope in giving this presentation is to share how adventure really shows up in our everyday and why that's of utmost importance. I'll give the caveat that I'm going to show you a bunch of slides from the very thing that I'm talking about speaking out against. And I recognize the paradox and the contradiction in that I am a mountain climber. That is my trade. And it makes for a great platform and metaphor from which to talk about adventure. That adventure in this one space can be so quickly and easily digested metaphorically, and then we take that and apply it back to our everyday lives. But even as a professional climber, the number of days that I spend in a tent, that I spend out in the field climbing every year is pretty nominal. It's not a lot of days compared to the number of days that I spend supporting my kids, being in partnership with my wife, being in my community, the everyday sort of experiences that we all have. I just so happen to step outside of that occasionally and into this other space. And the truth is, the reason why I do that is because it's hard for me to take these lessons I'm about to share with you and make them stick in my everyday without doing that. And that's just my own foible. But I think what you'll find is that the lessons and the approach is something that you already do in your life and you already bring forward. And my hope is to highlight that and support bringing that forth even more so. So as I'm doing the talk, I'm going to try and keep track of our time so that it keeps moving rapidly. There's a lot of photos and images here, so I'll move through them quickly while also sharing some anecdotes and some of my perspective. All the photos, except for one of them that you'll see in this presentation, are photos I've taken on expeditions. I would say I'm honing the craft of photography, but I'm also blessed to be in these beautiful environments. And if I take enough photos, then something's going to come out. And so we'll get to see a lot of that. But let me just start with just a sliver of my background. As Josh said, I'm a mountain guide by trade. I've been climbing since I was 16. I'm 47, and I am a psychologist by education and by profession. And I combine those two worlds together. So I work with individuals in a coaching environment. I take people on expeditions to help with these very things I'm about to talk about. And I write as well. I'm actually right now finishing the complete manuscript of my third book, which should come out hopefully by the end of the year or beginning of next year. So I'll start with what this is about. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about an expedition that I did 18 months ago on the 8th tallest mountain on the planet, a mountain called Manaslu, which is on the Nepal-Tibet border. And this is what Manaslu looks like from the valley floor. And it's, as you can see there, it is a massive, massive peak. It's one of the 8,000 meter peaks. If you happen to have watched a Netflix movie about a gentleman called Nims who climbed all 14 of the 8,000 meter peaks within a calendar year, he talks about his experience here. But it's a mountain that enters into the death zone, an altitude that the human body cannot sustain itself at. And so about 18 months ago, I set out to climb this mountain solo on my own, under my own power. And I'm going to tell you the story as to how that transpired and why. But to get there, first, it's important for me to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm not a climber by birth. I actually grew up in North New Jersey, urban environment, grew up in Newark, and didn't actually go hiking or go outside or anything of that nature until I was 16 years old, until I had the opportunity to be able to take an outward bound course and learn about this whole other world that I'd never had experience with. I was turned on by it. I loved it. But at that time, I was actually, believe it or not, I was in a punk rock band, and we had just signed a record deal, and I was fully on the trajectory of being in the band. So that's me, all moody and punk in Boston before a show. And so I went down that path for a couple of years until I realized that my calling was really to be outside and in the mountains. So I moved out to the Pacific Northwest, went to university in Tacoma, Washington, and just put all of my time and energy into learning how to mountain climb while also going to school. And in many ways, I could show you the highlight reel, just like any athlete or any professional at the top of their game can show a highlight reel as to all the successes they've had. But the reality is that it's been a totally jumbled mess along the way. I can pull out certain sections that line up and make it look amazing and great. But I've had way more failures in terms of binary success or not success than I have had traditional success. And it's these failures along the way that I have learned from and that have actually enabled me to sustain the career that I have and to be able to continue to be out in the mountains. I spent early part of my career traveling and climbing all over the world on basically I was climbing what's called the 7 summits, the highest points on every continent. And I lived out of a duffel bag. I had an apartment in Seattle, but my duffel bags were constantly coming and going as I went from one location to another, one continent to another, throughout following the calendar year, following the summer, essentially in every part of the world in order to be able to climb on these big expeditions. I began focusing on climbing 8,000 meter peaks, those 14 mountains I was talking about earlier, and figuring out how to run expeditions in those environments and support climbers to be able to reach these heights. At the same time, I also was climbing in environments, this is Patagonia, that were the antithesis of climbing in the Himalayas. So in the Himalayas, I'll go back here a second, you'll see there's these giant, there's ropes, there's ladders, there's lots of tools and massive expedition teams to support success in that environment, versus going to a mountain like this. This is Fitzroy in Patagonia, where it's just you and your climbing partners and no one else. And so there's 2 different styles of climbing: alpine climbing and expedition climbing. And expedition style climbing is a very slow, arduous, long-term type of climbing where there's lots of support along the way. It is what I would consider to be low risk in terms of it having high level of support, but you actually end up spending a lot of time in that environment, which becomes high risk just by nature. Whereas being in a mountains like these, it's just you and your small team. And as a result, you're much more nimble and quick, but you don't have a lot of support behind you in case you need help. And so through these experiences, what I really learned and wanted to focus in on are what I called the 5 elements of adventure. And so what I recognized was that whether it was on these big Himalayan expeditions or on a smaller team expedition, that there were 5 essential components that needed to be present for the expedition to be successful. And when I say successful, I don't mean just standing on the top of the mountain, but successful in terms of a cohesive team that's operating together, working well, where all of our skills are pulled together. Each person brings a specific, unique skill set. We have camaraderie, teamwork, and that we are able to operate and maintain friendship along the way. So I found that if one of these elements of adventure wasn't present, we may still be able to summit and stand on top of the mountain, but that it didn't give me as much meaning, and I didn't walk away from it feeling as content about the expedition, and it didn't feel successful, honestly. If I didn't stand on the summit of the mountain, but still had each of these 5 components present, it still was a successful expedition in my book. And so these 5 elements: high endeavor, uncertain outcome, total commitment, tolerance for adversity, and great companionship. And so a high endeavor is where your values and your actions come together. And we only have so many of these experiences in our lives. They're the aspects of our when we look back on our lives, the aspects of our lives that have had the most meaning and the most impact are where our values and our actions come together in a unique way. And that's the high endeavor piece. And the uncertain outcome is absolutely must be present. That's the linchpin of adventure, that without uncertainty, we're left kind of a color, like paint by number, fill in the dots, color in by the dots, amusement park ride type experience. That uncertainty, even though we attempt to push back against uncertainty at all costs, we're always trying to figure out how to manage risk so that things aren't uncertain at all. But that uncertainty is actually what connects us to being present and gives our lives that deep, deep meaning. Those high endeavors are connected to the sense of uncertainty. And total commitment is the ability to stay present and stay focused on the end result, regardless of what things shift and change along the way. I want to differentiate that total commitment is not like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and suck it up and make it happen, but instead total commitment is allowing new information, new experiences to occur, learning from those, and then applying them back to the end result. Tolerance for adversity, that's the component that is when our ability to have grit and determination to bring humor, to be able to react to challenging situations and not completely melt down and be so inundated and overwhelmed that we stop being able to function. And thankfully, tolerance for adversity is a contagious sort of experience in the world, that when we surround ourselves with others that are able to support and love and bring humor and humility to an experience, that acts like it's kind of like a buoy and lifts us up and allows us to be able to experience adversity while still moving forward. The final piece there is great companionship. It's the indelible marker of adventure, that at the end of the day, we're just humans moving through the world, and the relationship that we have with each other is what makes these high endeavors, this adventure experience, the most meaningful. And I would challenge you to think about how adventure has already showed up in your life. So in some ways, our marriages and our partnerships are some of the greatest adventures that we could possibly be on. The way that we raise our children, the way that we are in community, how we approach our businesses, how we approach our professional lives, that those, once we start to see them through the lens of the 5 elements of adventure, we see that adventure is not something that is just for Mount Everest, but it's a way of operating in the world as a whole. So I do not see on our side, Josh, if there's questions or thoughts, but if they come up, feel free to raise your hand or add to that.
Yeah, I think right now we've got the audio is turned off. Anyone can chime in with a question in the Q&A, and we can certainly interrupt that. And
Great.
I'm working on getting everyone's audio set so that they can actually unmute themselves. And
Okay.
Just
good.
To be continued.
Okay. I'm going to start with, I got a little crazy there. What is adventure? And for me, adventure really is this way of bringing all 5 of those elements together. And I found is that when I can start to identify projects, aspects of my life through that framework, it actually lifts me forward and gives me more creativity and energizes me to take more risk. And so during COVID, I found myself with my kids really trying to figure out how to model for them what it looks like to be in a challenging, difficult situation and to bring the sense of adventure forward and not to feel overwhelmed and burdened, but instead use it as an opportunity for rest and repurpose and redirection. And so during that time, I played with this idea as to how can I bring adventure closer into my family? And that's where this idea of climbing Manaslu came forth. So I decided that I was going to begin by modeling setting a big goal. I'd never climbed an 8,000 meter peak by myself before. So setting a big goal and then educating myself on it and physically training for it, and then bringing my family into the fold so that they became part of the process. And the first thing I did was start by just pulling out, I hadn't even gotten a permit yet or permission to go. And I just pulled out all the gear as if I was going to pack for the expedition. And I brought my kids into it and had them actually go through all the equipment and the gear, because prior to that, they just saw me as packing up my bags and going on a trip and then coming home. Instead, I brought it all out and I started planning and started creating. And within a few months, I had an order in place with logistics and the travel and the technical aspects taken care of, and began the process of going on expedition. And so brought my family into that. We had what's called a puja at the house, which is a ceremony of cleansing and of fresh start of prayer, in order to give blessing to the mountain and to my experience, and that I was going to be leaving for a few weeks in order to bring them as part of the expedition. So I left Seattle and flew to Kathmandu and then began the climb. So if you haven't been to Kathmandu, it's like stepping back in time in a lot of ways. It's a world that is the best way to describe Kathmandu. It's like it has a certain smell and aroma. It feels like a gateway to a world that barely exists on our planet. Kathmandu itself is a bustling, busy city, but once you leave there and head into the mountains, is a place that where there are no vehicles on any roads. People travel by foot or they travel by yak, or things are carried through the mountains. The villages are separated by days of travel versus hours on a bus or a car. And so being in that environment, it really helps just kind of shift your entire mindset so that your whole focus then moves towards being in the mountains and being focused on one thing at a time. And for me, it was Manaslu. So it's still COVID at this point, it's still in full force. So instead of taking alternative transportation, I took a helicopter into base camp. It's nice that there's Buddhist prayers everywhere, including inside the helicopter, which is a nice location to have someone have a prayer for. And then arriving in the mountains in Nepal on the way to Manaslu. You may or may not be aware, but a few years ago there was a massive earthquake in Nepal, and this area is basically made from stucco and slate rocks, and you can see all of these pieces here, all these slate that is torn down and fallen down. This is all from the earthquake. So these were buildings that had fallen down, and now these are new buildings that are built in their place. No vehicles, but there are roads which are for yaks and for different animals, and for people to travel on to move goods back and forth. So arriving in Manaslu, meeting some of the locals. This is a local monk who lives there, integrating with that community, and acclimating to be in the mountains and ready to go and do this big climb. One thing I want to point out is just like we have this sense of Kathmandu, Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan. These areas are kind of exist in a different realm, which they do, but they're also deeply tied to our modern way of living as well. This is actually a Buddhist monk who is operating his world on his iPhone. So it's like you've got both at the same time. You have communities that don't have any roads, no indoor plumbing, no indoor heating or anything like that, but then we still have modern technology. So I joined a team in order to share some of the logistics and support for base camp, and started hiking in to Manaslu. This is an aerial shot from a drone of what base camp looks like. It's basically underneath all that rock there that you see is that's old glacier. So it's frozen underneath there, and there's rock on top, and it slowly starts to melt, and the mountain is there behind. So you're living in base camp in order to be able to stay on dry land and then move up and down into the mountains in order to acclimate. Base camp, you have your own little tent, a little cot inside, and it's a place to rejuvenate, to rest and recover, and then move higher up into the mountains. Let me just catch up on my notes for a moment, just a second. So above 8,000 meters is what's called the death zone. And this is where it's a super high stakes game. It's cold, it's windy, it's icy, avalanches. It's a dangerous location because at that point, your body can't sustain itself on its own. If you do operate there without oxygen, it's for a short period of time. You can operate with oxygen for a longer period of time, but it's not in perpetuity. That your body is constantly degrading when you are in that environment. And so you kind of go back and forth between being in base camp and then being up higher on the mountain in order for your body to acclimate, and you go back and forth and back and forth. One thing to note is that climbing at altitude and on a big expedition like this is not something that happens by force. It's something that occurs through grace and confidence and clarity. That while you're in an environment that is so inhospitable that you can't force your way through it, you have to somehow allow your body and your mind to become one with that environment, to note and to figure out how to live in that space, while also being hyper aware of what's happening to you so that you can exit to be able to take care of yourself. That the more you force your way through it, the more dangerous it becomes. So it's not something that is, allows you to be able to thrive. I mean, when people say, "Oh, you're going to conquer the mountain," there's no conquering that takes place. The mountain is allowing you passage during certain windows of weather and seasonality. And while there are other people nearby, the battle and the work that you're doing is an internal one. There's constantly chatter in your mind, the same way that we hold anxiety in our everyday lives. It's just right here. There's no space for anything else other than what's happening right then in that moment. And while your mind may want to escape to what about this? What about that? It's the reality is you can only function in this space at that time. If your mind goes somewhere else for too long, you become that's when things start to slide out of control. You stop being aware of your own needs, you stop taking care of yourself, and that's where you get yourself in danger. So traveling through this terrain, you're constantly aware of weather, avalanche, snow conditions, your own heart rate, respiratory rate, how, what you're eating, how hydrated you are. And then we have these specific camps along the way that tend to be safer from avalanche, safer in terms of snowfall collection, and places where you can recover to then either go back down again as your body adjusts or to continue up higher on the mountain. You can see as you look through here, you see the track that goes through, and as the season goes on, the track changes based on conditions. Here's a scenario that we encountered as I got to the base of this section. We realized that it was no longer going to be passable without additional support, and so the decision was made that we were going to install a ladder to help move through that section instead of trying to climb the ice there on its own. So this is a selfie that I took while climbing up through this very section right here. And you can see I've got ascenders that are on the rope that help support me as I move through that to help for security. And then higher up on the mountain, we have more camps that we go through in order to acclimate. And as you get higher and higher, the amount of time you can spend in these camps decreases. And that's because your body is becoming less capable of living at higher altitude. So here's a great example that you look at a photo like this and it looks inspiring, powerful, daunting, possibly beautiful, whatever lens you look through. But inside the tent is another story altogether. So this is a picture that I took of myself as I was beginning to have some significant altitude sickness. You can see how puffy my skin is. That's as a result of my body no longer being able to basically decrease all of the fluid that I was taking in because I was having altitude illnesses. So your cells fill with fluid, whether it's your skin cells or your lungs fill with some fluid, and that's part of the altitude adjustment. Gorgeous opportunity. Like, one of the things that's so amazing is that you're in this beautiful, powerful location, and it's very difficult to separate yourself from this internal painful experience to see what's actually happening. I remember basically taking my camera, putting it outside the window of the tent, the door of the tent, taking a bunch of photos, and then going back to bed. So it does look inspiring, but it's actually quite challenging and difficult. So as you get higher on the mountain, I started to have more altitude illness and decided that it was time for me to go down in order to be able to acclimate and give myself a better chance of success. So I descended down back to base camp and through a couple storms, made my way down back to base camp in order to rest and recover. It's nice to be able to actually have some creature comforts in this environment. So shaving is super nice to be able to shave, wash your hair, brush your teeth, that kind of thing, and try and have some normalcy of life. I'm also at this point able to stay more connected to my kids and shoot some videos for them, do some FaceTime, that kind of thing, and stay connected to them. In some ways, base camp is like a sanctuary. You got the routine, your recovery, and it's a chance to pause the whole thing. The other great piece that I found through this at this moments was when I would change clothes or switch packs or get new gloves or something like that. I would find these little notes from my kids. So my 6-year-old wrote this was what she meant to say or what she meant to spell was foot, but one foot in front of the other. So these little notes that were placed there as ways to to stay connected and keep inspired and keep the love going. So at base camp, it's a chance to gather, rest, find yourself, and then prepare to set off again. And one of the most oddest experiences I've ever had on an expedition occurred on my next trip up the mountain. So I'm headed towards this location. This is Camp 1 on Manaslu. And so this is base camp. Headed up to Camp 1 and encounter this guy. So a dog had made his way up the mountain. I don't know if it's going to play or not, but up the mountain from the village below and just followed the climbers all the way up there and was living at Camp 1, it was amazing to be able to engage with like the playfulness and love of a dog in such an inhospitable environment. And then I was healthy and ready and made my way back up to begin climbing again. So stayed at Camp 1 with the intention to continue on to the other higher camps. Little drone shot between Camp 1 and Camp 2. There it is again. And so I'm headed up towards that high point. The summit itself is actually behind that. And as this photo is actually taken in preparation for the summit climb. The high point that is right here in the top of the screen is this point right here on the bottom. So as I'm climbing up there, I really am I'm keeping my focus on my goal, which is my health, my well-being, returning home safely to my family. But I'm also keeping the mantra going of aligning my own values and actions. I wanted to inspire and show myself and my family of what's possible when you're in a position of challenge and overwhelm. What can occur when we're intentional, when we have dedication, and we have tenacity. And that brought me on to my summit day. So that high point that you saw from the distance is right here, and this is the summit of Manaslu. We've got 2 climbers there on their way to the top. This is the high camp where I spent one night in preparation. At this point, I'm sleeping on oxygen. You can see that my face actually looks much better than it did previously. It doesn't look as puffy as my body's been able to adjust to the altitude and be in position to make the climb to the top. This is right near the summit of Manaslu, taken around 4:30 in the morning. A little bit higher as the sun had rose. I felt like I was confident and able to take my camera out, a photo near the top. And I want to show you what the summit looks like. It's an incredibly difficult place to actually take a photo, so I don't have a photo of myself on the summit. But this is from one angle of a drone, and this is from another. And here we go to the top. So the top of the mountain is right here, this little tiny peak. The other point that we were looking at is over here. You see my mouse, and you can see climbers that are en route to the summit right there. Successful summit, sunrise, things warm up, and I'm ready to descend back down, back to high camp. At this point, altitude illness had definitely come back to hit me full force. My face is really puffy. You can see my hands and fingers are puffy. I'm inside of a tent, and yet I still have all this frozen ice and snow attached to my down suit. And so I'm ready to descend and get down as quickly as possible. Reverse the whole route, back down to the base. It's amazing that you get down to a lower level and some humidity, and everything shifts, and your body just comes right back to life. A couple days later, clean up base camp, close it all down, head back down to the valley floor, and then wrap up the expedition. At that point, waited for helicopters to come back in, loaded up our duffel bags, got on the first helicopter I could to get out of there, back to Kathmandu, and then leaving the mountain behind. What I take away from this expedition is the absolute camaraderie on the mountain itself and the teamwork and dedication from my family while I was gone. That it really truly was. While I was solo climbing, and I summited the mountain by myself, I descended by myself, I managed myself throughout the entire experience, and yet at the end of the day, in no way, shape, or form did I do it by myself. There was absolutely a team effort and teamwork. And so this belief that even though sometimes our high endeavors are solo in nature, that they are only supported by the family, friends, and community and team that we wrap ourselves around in. So Manaslu, 26,781 feet. It's the 8th tallest mountain on the planet. While it was my own 2 feet that took me to the top, it was a community and family and friends that allowed that to happen. And when I look back on this expedition, the 5 elements of adventure are first and foremost the high endeavor, where the values and actions came into alignment, the uncertain outcome, total commitment, tolerance for adversity, and great companionship. And I'm going to stop sharing now so I can bring myself back to full screen. Josh, am I full screen now?
Yeah, you're back. The screen share is gone. We've got a couple questions.
But before we get to the questions, I want to just reiterate that we all have these massive opportunities in front of us. These massive, whether it's, this is obviously an exaggerated form of that, but the way that the opportunity we have to show up to bring our values and actions forward, I'm trying to think the best way to say this. It's our family, our partners, our children, they need that from us. They need that leadership. It's demanded from us to be able to show up and live here and now and today, as opposed to something in the future. That the future is so uncertain that today is all that we have. I have a colleague who has this mantra there. He says, today is the best day ever. And while I don't always feel that way about the physical day, his point is that this is the only day that we have. And so living our lives from that model, that when our values and our actions are in alignment, this is the opportunity we have to be in service to our family, be in service to our partners and to our children and our community. And this is all we have is this moment here today. And so the Manaslu expedition, really highlighted that for me, and that was my goal with it. And it continues to fuel me in terms of how I show up for my own family, friends, and community. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great, Matt. That it really ties in for, I know all of the folks that are on here, and I don't know that any of us have climbed an 8,000 meter peak, and probably most don't have that aspiration.
Sure.
But I love the way you're using that framework and specifically the 5 elements of adventure, of why it's so important for that to still show up in all of our lives.
Yeah.
No matter what, metaphorical mountain we may be chasing, it's so important to have that integrated into what we're already doing. And I think I love that you use your own expedition as the canvas to illustrate that, because those were some unbelievable pictures. And yeah, so let me throw a couple questions out here, and for anyone on here, you should have the ability at this point to unmute yourself and speak your audio. If not, certainly feel free to use the chat, type in a question, and I'll ask the question to Matt. So first one, Matt, and this goes back to your introduction of yourself at a young age. how does a young man finance scaling the 7 peaks around the world? Did you have a job at the time? These
Yeah,
things cost money. So how'd you do that?
they cost an absurd amount of money. So yeah, so I started by asking the question, I can't afford to do this. How can I figure out how to do this? So I did not have, a vault to pull from by any stretch of the imagination. Basically, what the way it transpired for me was that I was I was working. I was in college. I was working, and then I met some other people who were mountain guides, and I asked, basically, what does this involve? How does this work? And how can I mentor? How can I learn this trade? That sort of thing. And so I started from that perspective, and got very, very lucky that within a very short time, about 18 months into it, I met a guy who was going on an expedition to South America and he needed additional support. And I volunteered myself to go down there and follow. And while we were doing 3 trips on the same mountain. And on the third, between the second and third trip, he actually ended up, all he did was step off the curb in Santiago, Chile, and tore his ACL. And at that moment, the expedition was mine to lead. And so if we just kind of took off from there.
Oh,
So
wow.
a lot of it, it was definitely, it started in terms of working and guiding and cutting my teeth on different mountains. And then that shifted into sponsorships, partnerships, and some commercial enterprises along those lines. But yeah, it's not an inexpensive pathway by any stretch. Yeah.
And at what point in there did you get your master's in psychology?
Yeah, so I had a climbing accident on a trip and came back to the United States and needed surgery. And in my recovery process, saw this window and of time. And it's like, and what I realized along the way was prior to that, I kept seeing a pattern of the types of clients that were showing up on expeditions that were typically men that were feeling like there was something bigger than themselves they wanted to engage in, some big challenge they wanted to experience in the world. And then they would go on an expedition, and then that feeling would dissipate over time, and they'd come back on another one a couple of years later. It would dissipate, and that cycle would continue. And I realized that I wanted to be in better service to that population, to that group of people, and figure out how can we break this down so you can enjoy the climbing if you so choose, but you don't have to escape your life in order to live your life. And so that's where I decided to then go and get a master's in psychology in order to better support that.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. I've got my own questions, but I'm going
Okay.
to sit quiet here for a minute. Anybody that wants to unmute themselves and ask Matt a question,
I
fire
will say
away.
no dumb questions. So
No dumb questions.
like no dumb questions. Okay. Yeah. Hit me. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, I'll throw one in here. What have you seen in all the clients that you've guided and in your own life, just with people that you know? What has been the biggest psychological hurdle for building adventure in one's life? What is it that stops people from doing that?
Great question. I think the feeling that when X, then Y. You can fill in X and Y for anything you want. When I've saved this much, then I can do this. When I'm this fit, then I can do this. Whatever the X to the Y is. When X, then Y. And what that does is it keeps whatever you want to accomplish or experience as such a barrier that X continues to move, or it's very difficult to reach X for Y to occur. I'll share a story for myself that's really heartbreaking, actually. Is my father's 81 now, and his X then Y was, when I'm healthier, then I want to take my family on this trip to the Galapagos. And family being like kids and grandkids. That was the X to the Y. And he has stage 4 prostate cancer, and there will not be a trip to the Galapagos for the kids and the grandkids with the grandparents. It's not, won't happen. But that attitude, that way of being of when X, then Y, I see that consistently in holding people back from being able to step fully into their lives. And so we can always have good reasons for that perspective. And and it also holds us back from being able to live fully as well. So I think that is probably the big differentiator that I see, is working with what is versus working with what the desired state that people want it to be in order to move forward.
Yeah. And so what if that is, and I'm sure you've had these conversations with clients as well of yours, but what if that X is money based, right? So when I've hit some financial
Yeah.
goal.
Well, so it's twofold. One, I remember very early on in my career, I had a client who worked in finance. I think I was making like $30,000 a year at that point. And I remember we were talking, him saying, it doesn't matter what your salary is. The way you approach money is everything. So it doesn't matter if you're making 30,000 or 300,000. Your financial habits are what are going to dictate how you approach every problem. That piece combined with, and I look back on this situation with my father in the Galapagos isn't the issue, right? So it's not the if X, meaning if X with is, the amount of money needed to do a trip like that, then Y. But the Galapagos isn't the topic. The Galapagos is just the resource to experience what the topic is, which is dedicated, meaningful time with family. So the value is dedicated, meaningful time. So you work, whatever that is, let's make that happen, because at the end of the day, that's the crucial key component, not the physical locality or the dollars spent.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I think anybody listening to this on the call has probably heard me say the only value of money is in its use. Having a bigger bucket of money for the sake of that is kind of pointless. And if we're doing, as financial planners, if we're doing our job well, we're helping folks match the money with the value. Money is in service to the value. And I think that in a lot of ways, not completely, but in a lot of ways, maybe solves that when X then Y barrier when they're matched.
Yeah, I think it's a piece of, the other component to that is the thief of joy is comparison. Comparison is the thief of joy. So when we compare that, your neighbor or the other guy that took his kids to the Galapagos, but you're taking them to San Diego, again, it's not the location, it's the value. What is the value that you're bringing forward, and allowing that to be the lead, as opposed to and to give you the kind of the fire and the gumption to take action.
That's good.
Yeah. So I see there's a question from Michael about, are there more peaks calling you now?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, the answer is yeah. They do change and shift. I will be going back to the Himalaya in the spring to do another mountain that's similar to this, called Lhotse, in the same style. And I am also starting to explore other ways of being in the mountains, whether it's like bike packing is something that's of interest to me, is like long distance biking with gear. And so other ways of experiencing the mountains, not just solely in this trade or in this form, as well as empowering and teaching my kids to be able to explore the mountains in ways that they enjoy and they want to. So if I go back to the 5 elements of adventure, that's, if I use those as a guidepost in choosing how to be in nature and be in the mountains, then it's going to be a win-win. Yeah.
Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the expeditions that you do guide, the different levels, and is this bike packing, is that one of the things that you've done?
No, it's not one that I've guided. No, the way that I look at guiding and being in the mountains is, what is it going to be in service to my clients? How can it be in service to my clients? And I find that most of my clients, they want to either have big experiences with someone they love, so sibling, child, partner, something like that, or they are feeling overwhelmed in kind of their daily life, feeling a sense of maybe they're adrift in some ways, and they want to be able to go into the mountains, be in that environment, and essentially reset. And so I choose locations and mountains that serve that. So like one that's coming up this December is Kilimanjaro, which is a non-technical mountain. You don't need a rope for it. You don't need to have any previous skills. It's all you have to do is show up and be able to hike and trek with a 20-pound pack. Got a team of porters that helps carry all the gear, helps take care of all the food and that sort of thing. And what that mountain in particular is so powerful because you are unplugged, for 7 days you're on the mountain itself. And that is such a rare experience to unplug from connection and to be able to just be in a mountain environment, move at that time, to literally be living by the sun, the clock of the natural world, and to remove all of the digital noise. It's true. I can't overstate this, that I think it's one of the most spiritual experiences that we can give ourselves today, to be in that environment and to not be inundated with external noise, whether it's the internet, our phone, messages from whatever, but you're able to just stay present. So the expeditions I take people on are oriented that direction, and they're set up so you don't have to have any previous climbing experience at all. I like to phrase it as, if you can climb a ladder to put something on the wall or to get on the roof of a house, then you can go on 90% of the mountains in the world.
Matt, Josh, can you hear me?
Yep, fire away there, Line.
My name's Lion Gamble. I've never been on a Zoom meeting with Josh where I didn't have, just a lot to say. I want to ask you this. I've got a question and a comment. The question is there still snow on Kilimanjaro?
Yes. Yes, there is. Yeah, I think that they're estimating, sometime around 2050.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's still glacier and snow on the mountain. In fact, majority of the times when I summit the mountain, it will be with fresh snow on the route, and then there's the glacier on top.
Good.
Yeah.
I something that just kind of dovetails for me. I listen occasionally to Al Franken on his podcast. I admire him. He's a funny fellow and he's got a lot of good points. And he had on the latest one, a fellow that's a professor, I think at NYU, in marketing, several things. His name is Scott Galloway. I'd never heard of Scott Galloway, but he was just wonderful, I thought. And if this one time is an example of how his mind works, I'm going to hear more. But he's had great success with money, and he said everybody's got some kind of a target, this, that, and the other. And he started talking vast sums of money, and he said, I'm not playing that game. He said, I've decided when I'm getting close to that point, that's when I stop and I start giving it to people or institutions or whatever, because that's where I derive my joy, and it was such a refreshing thing. And I worry, you Matt have talked so much about nature and spirit, and you've talked something practically pre-industrial age. And I'm not at all sure that isn't the way it should be in our mindset. And I admire what it is that you've done. I fear that I'm probably a base camp kind of guy, but I've got my X's and Y's, and I've got my challenges, and you are an inspiration, and I love your metaphor. It works.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, what I find to be fascinating I would say this happens across the board. I can't think of a single instance where it hasn't occurred, is how rapidly and when we are in these environments, how rapidly we can revert back to a more primordial version of ourselves, even if it's just in the way that you rest and sleep, and the mind clearing and how time moves. But it's something that we have to really give ourselves the opportunity to do. So I have faith and I have hope that we as humans will continue to carve out spaces in order to do this, in order to be connected with each other without distraction, without noise. But it definitely, at this junction in time, it definitely takes effort to get there. Yeah.
Great. We're at the top of the hour, so I'm gonna let this carry on for a few more minutes. And folks, if there's any other questions, unmute yourself and jump in here. I think I have one more question that I'll add before we finish here, Matt, but I would love for anyone else to chime in here for a second. This is where I should have been prepared with the Jeopardy music playing in the background. All right, let's maybe finish with this one. So, we all are not as young as we used to be. How do you encourage people to integrate the adventure, but specifically the five elements as you talked about them, but integrating adventure into their life, even as we all progress to different ages and stages that mean we can't do things the way that we used to. So how do you encourage folks to still continue to engage?
I have a quick answer to that. And so give me a second to share it, and I'll share that my hope is that it's delivered in a way that is not morbid at all. I think it actually it's the opposite. One of the pains I see that we experience in the world is that we have an attachment to a previous version of ourselves, whether that's our 18-year-old self, our 30-year-old self, our 50-year-old self, whatever it is. We have an attachment to our previous version of ourselves and a belief that we should have gotten to a certain point where we are today, that version of ourselves. And so it keeps us from engaging in adventure or engaging in our lives, who we are at this very moment, not who we were when we were 18 or 40 or whatever it is. So there's a disconnect between the acknowledgement of who we are today versus who the previous version of ourselves. And that disconnect can keep adventure from occurring. The second part of that is, like, once that awareness settles in, the second part of that is to take a moment with a blank piece of paper and acknowledge your own obituary. So let's say you're 70 years old right now and you are going to die when you're 90. The next 20 years has yet to be written. So there's a framework for it, but the actuality has yet to be written. So I look at adventure as, what are those next 20 years? What is it I'd like to experience in the world? What would I be remiss if I didn't experience? What are my desires? And how can I make that happen? And so looking at it from the point of view of my age today to 90, what adventure experience is sitting right there that meets where I am, who I am right now, not who I was or where I was before, but who and where I am right now, and then painting that forward. What is the narrative that is in front of us, and then taking that information and sitting down with partner, spouse, child, whoever it is, to explore how to make that happen and how to bring that forward. So I think that's how you step fully into adventure at any stage of your life versus looking backwards and wishing and hoping that you had shown up in a certain specific way.
That's great. And that's certainly, I think, a great way to wrap this up and puts a really nice bow on the whole arc of what you've taken us through tonight. Any final thoughts or anything else you want to add before we end the call?
I would just say, if you're curious about the 5 elements of adventure and you want to learn more, send me a message. My phone number is 520-360-1465. Then we can set up a time for a short conversation. I can share with you some different documents, some different information as to how to look at the 5 elements of adventure, how to work with it, and support you towards that next step, to be able to take from where you are right now to where you want to go at 90. And so Josh and I talked before the call, like how can I best be of support to those that are on the call, and I want to extend that as an offer. So send me a message. I'll reply back. We'll find a time. We'll take 30 minutes. I'll share some of the 5 elements of adventure in more detail, and we can take next steps from there.
Cool. All right. Well, Matt, again, thank you very much for being on here. I think this has been and will continue to be a valuable resource for our clients at Ridgeline. And so thank you for doing this and joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining me, and thank you for hosting, Josh.
All right. See everybody soon. Okay. Man, I really enjoyed that. I hope you did as well. The next one will be coming at you in a couple weeks, so stay tuned. Until then, I hope you have your own great adventure.